This chapter is on business cycles, which is recurring changes in the levels of unemployment and inflation. Actually, more precisely, is changes in the growth rate of GDP. But of course, unemployment and inflation are related to GDP, as we've explained earlier. My subtitle is The Economy Goes Up and Down. In the perfect world, we would grow at a nice steady pace continuously. Historically, that steady pace has been about 3.1%. But in fact, that's not what happens. We grow faster, we grow slower, and sometimes we grow negatively. In other words, GDP doesn't go down or doesn't go up, it goes down. By definition, the decline in the GDP for 2 consecutive quarters is considered a recession. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about why those business cycles occur, and later we'll talk about how we can hopefully ameliorate them to some extent and make them not quite as bad. There are 4 phases of the business cycle. The first is the peak. At the peak, you have low unemployment and rising inflation. What is happening here is your economy is pushing probably very close to the maximum output, out toward the production possibility curve. As it gets there, obviously more resources are employed, but if you push too hard against that production possibility curve, you'll start to see prices rising simply because you can't really produce any more product. Simple example, if I want to get employees when we have full employment, what do? I go out and hire other employees by paying them more, which causes wages to go up, which causes prices to go up. Second, there's a recession. This is after the peak. The economy begins to slow down. It may actually do more than slow down. It may actually have a negative growth rate. What happens here is we have rising unemployment with falling output. Those are always going to go together because as we produce less, we need fewer people to produce it, and the inflation rate's probably going to decline. If it gets serious enough, prices could actually decline and we would actually have deflation. At the trough, output stops falling. If you're at the bottom of the hill, you might say, and inflation is going to be very low, or as I said, it could actually be negative, meaning we could have deflation. Just a small point. If we do nothing, if we have no policy to do anything, we will eventually begin to rise again. This is one thing you have to understand as we go through policy. If we do absolutely nothing, we will finally get back to full employment. It's how much time it takes becomes a major issue. Then there's expansion. Output begins to rise and unemployment starts to decline. Unemployment is what we call a lagging indicator, which means as the economy improves, unemployment may not begin to drop. In fact, it could rise. There are a couple of reasons that would be true. First of all, companies probably have employees that they're not working at optimal capacity. For instance, we've had a slowdown. You're telling the employees, well, let's go clean out the closets, let's do some cleaning up, and we'll do a little painting. And since we're not really producing product, obviously when you start to pick up, we take them off those jobs and we put them back into production. So, that's one reason. The second reason is that, companies are going to be a little reluctant to hire people unless they're absolutely sure they're going to be able to keep them. So unemployment starts to decline, but initially, like as I said, it could actually rise. Another reason it could rise is because to be unemployed, you have to be actively seeking work. And if you have totally dropped out and then come back in, suddenly you are unemployed. So it's not unusual as an economy picks up to actually see the unemployment rate rise. So what are the causes of recessions? Well, this isn't really generally agreed upon. Over the years, we've had great arguments about what caused recessions. But every time we seem to come up with an answer and we'd say we can solve that problem, we simply got another recession. So it probably is, quite honestly, it's a combination of many things, a very complex relationship. In general, You could say, well, demand drops. That was kind of the Keynesian approach. But that may be begging the question. Of course, demand drops. People aren't buying as much. Companies aren't buying as much. But that really doesn't answer the question as why they aren't in many cases. But let me go through this list of causes. The first one they list here is irregular innovation. A couple things here I think are notable. Number one, innovation. What do we mean by that? When something, there's a very long period of time between the time something is invented and something is innovated. So for instance, if you invent a new product, that simply means that you've figured out a way to do it, you maybe get a patent on it. Innovation means it's come into general use among the public. And innovation lags way behind invention. In fact, studies have shown it's about a 25-year lag, and when you take something like the steam engine, it was 150 years. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So irregular innovation simply says that we don't get the continuous innovation, and we don't get continuous good innovation. We're always getting innovation, but are we getting something that's really going to have a big impact? Well, think of the computer revolution. That had a huge impact on industry. What happened somewhere back there, companies quit being concerned about machinery wearing out and started to be more concerned about it becoming obsolete. So you could have a piece of equipment to work quite well, but it really was so obsolete nobody could use it. Let me give you a simple example. I have a computer with Windows 95 on it. Oh, I do a few things with it, but for the most part it's obsolete. If I put a major piece of software on there, it will take up the whole hard drive. I won't be able to use it. So I really can't use it for very much. So what we're really talking about here oftentimes the term is called killer apps. What are the ones that really are going to drive the economy? And again, one of those was computers, and maybe to some extent others that will come from computers. For instance, more talk of driverless cars. Will that have a major impact? I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe possibly negative, at least for a while. Second are productivity changes. These are important. What we usually find when the economy goes downhill and we get into recession, productivity declines. And until you can increase that productivity, companies are really not going to be able to hire people or raise wages. So productivity changes become very important. If you have a high rate of productivity increase, that's probably going to spur the economy, because that means companies are able to basically produce more with less. That frees up money either in the form of profits or cash flow. That may allow them to go out and hire more people, and obviously that's going to help the economy. On the other side, back in the 70s, productivity changes were just about non-existent. And we got into a terrible situation. We got high inflation rates and the high unemployment rates, which up to then we said, this can't happen. Well, it did, and we'll talk about why later. Monetary factors. Well, there's a very famous book written called The Monetary History of the United States by Milton Friedman and Anna Jacobson Schwartz. They studied about 100 years of history of the United States and the role that money played in it. And they concluded that when the money supply drops, you get a depression, and when it simply slows down, you get a recession. So their point is that monetary factors always play a big part in business cycles. To some extent, that's true, although they may play a bigger role in getting us into recessions than getting us out. Political events can have impacts too. For the most part, in the United States, we sort of feel like the candidates are going to kind of keep up the same, generally the same approach to government as others. But if you go to other countries, for instance, France several years ago, they elected a socialist. And literally, overnight, building in France ceased because he was talking about very high tax increases. And so foreign companies and they're just sort of walked away from projects. So political events like that can cause recessions, and we've seen it happen in other countries, especially when a company or a government comes in that wants to raise taxes and you'll have a lot more regulation. Financial instability too. Right now I would tell you that we do not have a stable financial situation. And one of the big things that brings about financial instability is over leverage. In other words, over borrowing, and we have definitely done that. We've borrowed too much money for the most part to keep our economies going and to keep us going. So that creates financial instability. Finally, declining demand. I kind of added this one. It probably catches all the others to some extent, but if for some reason consumers all of a sudden stopped buying products, that might set off a recession. Now what would be the cause of that? Well, that's always a great question. And would it have been something else that caused a declining demand? Answer that, yeah, probably would. But should consumers suddenly just quit spending, you would find that would probably lead to a recession. How about uneven impact on the economy? Well, there are three aspects of this. In industry and manufacturing, you basically have two types of goods: durable goods and non-durable goods. Durable goods are goods that we buy that are fairly pricey. We don't replace them often. Let me give you examples: refrigerators, stoves, furniture. Okay, those are goods that last. So when we buy them, we figure they're going to last 5 to 10 years. Also, in many cases, we could probably keep the old one and keep it functional for some time if we simply don't want to go spend the money. The other set of goods are non-durable goods. These are things like food and clothing would fit in there, and probably first aid, maybe some healthcare would fit in there. So of these two types of goods, when the economy goes into recession, durable goods orders suffer the most. Non-durable goods orders usually don't suffer too much. Yeah, there will be drops in sales, maybe. But let's be honest, when you go to the drugstore and you need some aspirin for your headache, you're going to buy it. Or if you got to go buy some Band-Aids because you cut yourself, you're going to go buy it. On the other hand, if you're buying a new refrigerator, especially some of the more expensive ones today, you'll really think about, well, do I really have the money to do this? The other thing is durable goods are often financed, which is another reason that people would be reluctant to buy those in a recession. Also, some people are impacted more than others. When the economy goes into the recession, it's not like everybody loses 10% of their job. There are going to be some people who lose all their job, and other people who don't lose jobs at all, and other people who are probably going to even work more. And by the way, that sounds strange, but I've heard it complained about many times by people who work for companies when they tell me that I wish this recession would get over, the overtime is killing me. So, you really see the difference, because again, kind of like in a durable, non-durable goods situation, non-durable goods will keep being produced. Durable goods, sales fall, they'll lay off workers. What about unemployment? Well, there are three types of unemployment. One is structural, the other is frictional, and the third one is cyclical. What do these mean? Well, first of all, let me define unemployment. In order to be unemployed, one must be not working a job, but must be actively looking for a job. So if you're employed 1 hour a week, you're really not considered unemployed. Another example, you're going to college, you're not looking for a job. You're not unemployed. You just don't exist in the statistics. Suddenly you graduate and you go out in the market and you're looking for a job. You just became unemployed. So even though this is the general definition we use, there are actually, if you get into the Department of Labor numbers, they have all kinds of different measures. People who are underemployed, maybe working part-time jobs when they went full-time jobs. And the numbers we get in that case are different. But what do we mean by each of these? Okay, so the first one's frictional. In an economy as large as ours, there are always going to be changes going on. And some companies are going to be hiring, some are going to be laid off, and there's going to be an ebb and flow. The other is people, as the economy gets really good and they don't think they have a problem finding a job, they'll just quit. They are now unemployed. All of that is what we call frictional unemployment. It will always exist. If, for instance, many years ago we used to talk about the low unemployment rates in Japan, they were about 1%. Well, one of the reasons you have low unemployment rates in Japan is people never change jobs. Most of us, quite honestly, couldn't get a job in Japan because they would think we were just hopeless job hoppers. I've been told if you have more than 3 jobs in your lifetime, they just think you're a hopeless job hopper, and that probably includes everybody in this listening to this has probably had at least 3 jobs, even if they're only about 18 years old. Second, structural. This is unemployment caused by changes in the structure of the economy. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, let me give you a historical context of this. Many years ago, the federal government was very involved in space exploration, and we had NASA, and of course NASA was letting big contracts to many companies. We have an administration who finally said, look, we want to cut back on aerospace spending, so we're going to cut a lot of those expenditures out. Two places in the country, Wichita, Kansas, and Seattle, Washington, were very big into the aerospace industry. You know, Boeing is in Seattle. Obviously, they know something about flight, and Wichita had a lot of aerospace connections too. Well, those economies just went down the tank. I mean, Wichita probably had about a 20% unemployment rate. Things were really bad in Seattle. In fact, they were so bad that the Japanese were sending care packages to people in Seattle. And that, again, happened simply because of change in the structure. In the Quad Cities, when I first came here about 30 years ago, what was happening was all the farm machinery companies were closing. That was a structural problem because we were so dependent on the farm machinery industry. You quite bluntly couldn't go anywhere else in the country and get a job with the farm machinery industry because most of them were right here. That was a structural change. Now what's happened is we have a more diversified economy, just as Seattle does, just as Wichita does, and so they're not as hard hit by this. But again, if you are really dependent on one industry and it changes, that's where you're going to get a lot of structural change. Now, of those two, there's not much policy can do about either one of them. Frictional, it's not going to affect it. Structural, not really going to affect it. What about cyclical? Well, that's a different one. That is caused by the ups and downs in the economy. Let's go back to the durable goods. Durable goods companies are laying workers off because people aren't buying them. 6 months later, sales of durable goods pick up and they get called back. Not unusual. Deere and Caterpillar are considered cyclical employers. Why? Because they really get hit hard when we have a recession. Finally, there's full employment. And full employment, we used to actually try to target a percentage for full employment, and we started to get away from that because we really concluded that you couldn't define a specific percentage. And we started using the term natural rate. And I'm going to tell you exactly what natural rate is. It was actually a much longer term, and then you can proceed to forget it if you want, but the meaning is pretty important here. It was often called, the acronym for it was the NAIRU, N-A-I-R-U, which stood for the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. Okay, mouthful, right? Well, what that meant was it was the unemployment rate that would not raise or lower the inflation rate. And so we started calling that the natural rate. And in fact, the way the Federal Reserve does, the people who run monetary policy, they keep a close eye on inflation. Is inflation rising, to give them an indication if we are near full employment or the natural rate? What are the economic costs of unemployment? Well, one is that you simply aren't producing as much as you did before. Again, imagine our production possibility curve, but you're inside that. Okay, so you would have what we call a gap, a production gap. And if you compare where we should be producing to where we are producing, that's called the GDP gap. Okun's law relates unemployment to this gap. I've never been a huge fan of Okun's, but it seems to be in every book, so let me just explain what it means. It isn't really complicated. It says a 1% increase in unemployment above the natural level, or in other words, if unemployment gets 1% higher than the natural level, which we'll also interchangeably call full employment, that will lead to a 2% GDP gap. You might ask, why not 1%? The answer is, I can't answer that. It's just, this is a statistical analysis he has done and says that, look, a 1% increase in unemployment will cause actually a 2% GDP gap. And again, some of the other costs are that we said they're unequal burdens. I addressed that a little bit, but I want to do it more specifically here. Groups that get hurt badly are the unskilled for two reasons. Number one, last hired, first fired for the most part. Companies are going to hire the best employees, the skilled employees, and they may hire unskilled employees. The other problem is so many unskilled workers really do repetitive jobs, which one or two things happens. They simply won't need them, or more and more we're beginning to use technology to replace them. Younger people, same thing. Last hired, first fired. They also have less experience. So they're kind of, in many times, in the unskilled category, but the other problem is they have no seniority either, so they tend to lose their jobs. And most companies operate on seniority. They're going to keep the people who have been there the longest. Some ethnic groups, well, blacks have high rates of unemployment, and they usually go up more in a recession than they would than other groups. Hispanics, also true. They seem to be hit worse by unemployment. On the other hand, in many of these cases, many of these ethnic groups, the people tend to be unskilled and younger. So it may not really have anything to do, or as much to do, with the ethnic groups. And then also in some cases, they just don't have as much contact to find jobs. On the other hand, Asians actually have a lower unemployment rate, and so it doesn't seem to affect them as much. And white women, or women, have a lower unemployment rate than men during these periods of time now. That used to not always be true, but it is today. I don't know if I have an explanation for it, except that, for instance, if you're a man working in some of these industries, you're more likely to have a job such as, production, and if they kept production back, they will get rid of you, but they need the women in the office to continue to fill orders and bring down inventory. The less educated tend to have more unemployment for a variety of reasons. They don't have skills. They're very difficult to move from one job to the other a lot of times. And finally, duration. That may be an unequal burden, but more than anything, it's really important just to understand it. What does it mean? The longer certain groups, and there's two things. In a very severe recession, the duration of unemployment will tend to be very high. In the last recession, we had a lot of people who were unemployed. They were actually drawing unemployment for 99 weeks. That was unheard of. At one time, 26 weeks is the longest you could draw it. And there were people who had long-term unemployment of 2 and 3 years. That can be a very, very difficult situation, because the longer you're out of the job market, the harder it is to get a job. What about inflation? Well, inflation is a general increase in the price level. The inflation rate uses a price index, which is a percent change during the period equal to the index value of the current period minus the index value of the past period divided by the index value of the past period. So what do we mean here? Well, assume a current index value is 150, and the last period it was 147, then the inflation rate is 150 minus 147 over 147, or 2%. So you can see as those index numbers rise, you have to get a bigger difference to get the same percentage increase. For instance, if that were 103 and 100, that would be a 3% increase. So, and the index numbers can get very large. They don't always change the base year all the time. What are the different types of inflation? Well, one's demand pull. This shifts the demand curve to the right. So I'm going to have you think about demand and supply curves in a very simple way here. What does that mean? Well, if you hold the supply curve constant and you shift the demand curve to the right, what's going to happen? Well, companies are going to sell more products and prices are going to rise. And if they do that too much, if there's that kind of a demand increase continuously, then we begin to get near or strike up against the production possibility curve. We can't really produce anymore, so that all happens as we get inflation. This has sometimes been described as too much money chasing too few goods. Probably not a bad analogy, you might say. In other words, people have money to spend, except we really don't have the goods that they want to buy. Then, on the other hand, there's something called cost push. This does not disturb the demand curve, but it shifts the supply curve to the left. And if you remember, if we hold demand constant, shift the supply curve to the left, what happens? Well, two things happen, actually. Number one, you get less output. And two, you get higher prices. So how could this happen? Well, it happens because you have increased cost of inputs. For instance, union goes on strike, demands a higher wage, gets it. Well, we now have an increased increased cost of inputs there. This will shift the supply curve to the left, and what that will do, it will raise prices and it will reduce output. The one thing about demand is that even though it's raising prices, it increases output. Here, you're reducing output while raising prices, and that makes actually for a much worse situation. If you go back in the 1970s and analyze what we called stagnation or stagflation, which was high levels of unemployment with high levels of inflation, it can be explained by cost push inflation. Part of that was due to oil price increases, a lot of it due to regulation, and some that was imposed by. What about the redistribution impacts of inflation? Well, we know that inflation actually redistributes income and wealth from one group to another. Why is that? Well, we discussed the difference between nominal and real income previously, and that really is impacted by inflation. Nominal income is what you receive in dollars for income, but real income is what indicates what you can actually buy with that. So as inflation rises, or in other words, prices rise, even though your nominal income may go up, your real income may go down if your income doesn't rise as fast as the inflation rate. So therefore, real income's dropping while inflation rates are going up. In the election of 1976, that was a big issue. Jimmy Carter had been president, it was 1980, and people had seen their standard of living declining, and people don't like that very much, and it was probably the major reason that Jimmy Carter lost the election. Fixed income receivers tend to be hurt too because their income doesn't rise, but prices do, so they can now buy less with it. This is really one of the problems people have today when they retire is, do I have enough money to see me through? Well, we don't know what price increases are going to look like, and if you don't have enough money and it doesn't have enough return, it's not going to keep up with inflation. So 20 to 30 years down the road, you may still be alive, but you may not have enough income. Savers are hurt. This is a group that has saved their money, put it into a bank or some kind of an investment, and they tend to be hurt by inflation because that money sitting there now buys less than it did before. In today's market, if you put your money in a bank, in a savings account, you're probably getting less interest than the inflation rate. So the interest rate's actually lower than the inflation rate. So you're really losing ground all the time. Even though the inflation rate's really low, it tends to be higher than the interest rate. Creditors are hurt. This is a group that has loaned you money, but they're now being paid back with cheaper dollars. And unless they have an interest rate that's high enough to offset that inflation rate, they're going to be worse off. And so creditors get hurt by inflation normally. Flexible income receivers are not hurt. They may actually be helped because their income may go up as fast or faster than the inflation rate. So they don't tend to be hurt as much, but at least they can adjust their income so that they have more income to offset the impacts of inflation. Debtors are not hurt either because as prices rise, they're paying off with cheaper dollars. So for instance, today you can buy a house, probably get an interest rate around 3.5%. And then if all of a sudden housing prices and other prices start to rise by 5 or 6%, again, you're paying off with cheaper dollars. You're actually paying off with money that's falling faster in value than the interest rate. So the redistribution impact of inflation can be great for some people. What about inflation and output? Well, we really talked about that a little bit earlier with demand pull and cost push. Cost push inflation causes an increase in prices but a decrease in output because this is a leftward shift of the supply curve. When you shift the supply curve left and you keep demand constant, what happens? Prices rise, output falls. In the economy, if that happens and output falls, that means people are losing their jobs, but to double the insult, they're now paying higher prices for everything they get. And again, in economics, we now call that stagflation. Demand pull causes an increase in prices and an increase in output. In this case, it's really being pulled up by rising demand. We sometimes say this is too much money chasing too few goods. So demand pull causes an increase in prices, but it also increases output. So at least with increased output, more people are hired or their wages go up, and this can offset the price increases. One of the things we see reported, obviously we see inflation reported monthly, but what we normally report is something called the core rate of inflation. We strip out energy prices and food prices to give you that inflation rate. You might say, well, that doesn't make any sense because that's two items in my budget. Food's kind of big, and energy may be rather large too if you're talking about gasoline prices. Well, why is that? Well, this is partly because they're so volatile. We know that energy prices, and I use gasoline as an example, are quite variable. A few years ago, we were paying $4 a gallon. Now we're paying $2 a gallon. Earlier in the year, we were paying down around $1.40 a gallon. What that would do is that would make inflation look like it was going up and down like crazy. For policymakers, they really can't run policy based on a highly variable inflation rate, especially one that's going up and down. And so, therefore, we use that core rate of inflation to explain inflation. Is that a good way or a bad way? Well, you have to be partly to judge by it, but it's probably over the long run, stripping out those two pretty well offsets, and the core rate of inflation is probably a better indicator. Hyperinflation is something we have never seen in the United States. It's a very high rate of inflation, usually due to the government printing too much money. It's happened in many countries. For instance, in Germany, I think it was 1914 and 1917, they had what we call hyperinflation. Prices, it was said, rose so fast that the companies paid the workers twice a day so the wives could meet their husbands at the gate to pick up the money to get to the store before they raised the prices. That's hyperinflation. This is rates in the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000% a year. More recently, Zimbabwe and Africa had the highest rate of inflation ever recorded in modern times. It was so high that they eventually printed new currency. I believe the dollar is their currency, and they were printing $10 trillion notes. And what did that buy? Just about nothing. So that's what we mean by hyperinflation. Can it happen? Absolutely. We know why it happens, but luckily in our country, we've never had it. So that ends our discussion on the business cycle, and so we'll turn to another issue in the next chapter.